economists and lawyers. And it sets out the reasons why, if the UK leaves the EU, as it will do, why we should consider leave it too. And it would be very useful if local groups, or some of you individually, would take it and set up a local study group or a group of friends and neighbours to study the EU, because a lot of people don't know much about it. And in principle, I've got no party involvement or party political allegiance, but I'm happy in principle to speak at such meetings, and if I get a decent invitation, you know, so that'd be worth doing. One needs to study and find out, because you're not getting it from the newspapers, you're not getting from the truth from the mainstream media. One must do a bit of study about EU matters, because you know, people just don't realise how this state has been, you know, so absorbed largely in the EU project, and what is needed to get it out and get back our independence and democracy.
I think we need to find a certain psychological disposition, because we're, in theory, moving into another boom, and that can be a bad time for any kind of political consciousness raising or activity. So we need to actually imagine, okay, we're in 2005, and 2008 is coming, and 2010 is coming again after that. And any time we flag, or any time we think, you know, we're the only ones who are wrong. I remember actually back in the 90s writing a book in 1995 which was titled Every Day Like Sunday, which was a prophecy about the future of Ireland, particularly down the country, where every town was like its dead. Every day is boogie on Sunday. And the day after it came out, it was proved wrong about everything. And you know, for 10 years or more, it was like you couldn't even open your mouth about these things. Now they're all true again, or they have been true again in the last few years. So we need to sustain ourselves through that period by remembering that if the boom is here, the bust cannot be far behind, and that's what we're waiting for. Because if we've been here with this kind of energy in 2010, ready, 2011, I believe a movement like this would have swept the boards at that point.
Another question? Your good self.
If there's a strive towards national autonomy, what's it to stop? Like, I know trade always connects countries. What's it to stop it being just like what it was like at the start? And Ireland is a very good track record of international affairs. But what's it to stop it just being like the First World War and the Second World War?
I didn't catch the question.
Sorry, could you
why,
slowly? I can't. It's too fast.
Sorry, yeah. Why wouldn't countries if there's no union, isn't there going to be conflict in between them? Would you not say?
I would recite President Trump's line in a State of the Union speech: America first, but not America alone. And if Ireland were to leave the EU, there are various models that can be followed: the Norwegian model, the Canadian model. It doesn't mean that we become a sort of a Northwest European version of North Korea. If we look, if we look at Iceland, for example, Iceland is way more remote than us. It's got a population of 300,000. It also had a bust. And if they're able to survive and prosper, why the heck can't we?
James, no question.
Thank you, panel. I had wished to direct this question to Nigel, but maybe some member will.
But he's not here because it's only Irish people.
I appreciate that. No, my question is relevant to Nigel's request for an inquiry into the influence of George Soros in the EU and other members. What's your view on that request and the influence that George Soros and others have on EU policy?
Well, it's well known that there are a wide range of private think tanks which involve the great and the powerful that have a huge influence in EU policy. The European Roundtable of Industrialists was where the single market was first thought of, specifically Philips. They had a conference, and then out of that came the Roundtable, and then came the single European market. And there are, of course, groups like the Bilderberg Group, the Trilateral Commission, and, of course, there are individual people like Soros, who's got this huge, well-endowed foundation, and they in general, push globalization and interact with their opposite numbers all over the place. And that's what you'd expect them, from the point of view of their own individual interests, to do. They're very powerful, they're very well moneyed, and they're very well connected. So that these interactions are hugely influential in the development of EU policy, and they interact happily with the bureaucrats in Brussels. The late Peter Sutherland was, of course, an obvious example here of such a person who could lift a telephone to anyone among the powerful of the earth. As he said, Peter Sutherland is bad, I don't say anything bad about the recently dead, but he said the day after the British Brexit referendum, this result must be overturned at all costs. He was quoted in the Irish Times as saying that. And that is the attitude of the Soroses of this world.
Karen?
Just to add to that, one of the things I had talked about in my speech was about the role of credit default swaps, CDS. Not to go into the detail here, but as part of my own research, I saw that the European Parliament was going to bring in a directive, a piece of legislation to try to stop basically casino gambling of worth up to like hundreds of billions, as to whether a particular government would default or a bank would default. And when I looked at an advisory board that was put together in order to basically give professional advice to the European Union on creating this legislation, who was on this? All of the vested interests who were actually gambling the credit default swaps. And so they were shaping this legislation to suit themselves. And in the end, although the legislation was actually very good and concrete, right at the end, they slipped in a loophole that said that, well, we can actually not we don't have to abide by this law if there's certain circumstances that arise in which we shouldn't. So I think that there's a huge relationship between some of the global corporations like Goldman Sachs, etc. And you only have to look at Jose Manuel Barroso. Like, where was his next work post after he left as the head of the Commission? He went to Goldman Sachs. And if you look at, say, was it Mario Draghi, the EU basically imposed a government on Italy, and again, ex-banker, ex-Goldman Sachs. And then when you look at the stability mechanism and the fiscal compact, if you look at the board of directors in relation to that fund, the stability mechanism, the board of directors, I did all the research on them, and they're all ex-sort of central bankers linked to the ECB. So I think that when you dig in enough, you see how the networks are there, and they are very much corporatist.
Thanks very much for coming in today. It's great to see a push towards our exit. So I just want to know if you think Ireland's pharmaceutical, how much exports we have in pharmaceutical, we could hold the EU to ransom or get more favourable trade deals if we eventually push towards our exit. We could use our huge pharmaceutical trade to our favour in getting more favourable trade deals.
I think it would be difficult. I think the trouble is, if you're a country of 5 million, it's very difficult to blackmail an entity of 500 million. I think we would effectively, if we were to leave, we'd be given a menu of options, and we might get some tailoring around that. I think, just as a side issue on this, I think one aspect that the Irish government should push very hard for, maybe slip it in at the end of the Brexit negotiations, would be some clause to the Brexit deal making it available to any other country that later chooses to leave the EU. And the advantage of that is that rather than have this 2-year black hole, there would at least be one viable alternative, and that you could fall back on that if negotiations. It would create an institutional ratchet that would be in favour of those who prefer less EU power, to counterweigh all of the institutional ratchets they've put in place to favour their agenda.
Just in response specifically, I suppose, to the pharmaceutical industry, we just need to be careful about overstating the importance